But I know I have a little girl.
Just gonna go.
Okay. Sorry. I might need you guys to just like separate a bit so we can record that.
Is that like how we're recording?
Yeah.
It's like
Thank you.
The chairs are on wheels. Good shape for that.
They said you just follow the coast.
it's pretty great.
Do you want me to share the link with you? So you can tweet it?
Oh yeah, please. And then I'll do a quick intro if you want to say something prior. Go ahead as well. Like
Sure.
whatever you. I think it's always nice if you just
Yeah.
put the word out as well. That's cool.
Sure.
This is so exciting. So was this prompted you to do that because of that guy, or did you have you thought about doing?
No, I don't know why we didn't. Well, because before we were recording on this computer as well, so I couldn't do the same thing twice. But now that we have that thing, I'm like, okay, now we can try this out and see if the live broadcast works.
That's awesome.
Sorry.
Actually, I'll probably disconnect.
Okay.
You just have to move closer. Oh, so you can get those. So I guess so. I'm like either just really there's a lot of hours. That is just probably better off. When you want to start. Nice. What are you doing?
Alright, that is good.
There you go.
Is that the target he's wearing on his neck? Yeah.
All right, I think we'll kind of get started. So thank you guys for coming out on a cold evening again. I think winter meetups are always the hardest, but I'm glad you guys all made it. If you guys, how many of you guys haven't been to a WebPerf meetup before? See a bunch of new faces. Great. Well, welcome. This is the Event Mobi office. So just to give you a little bit of an intro, we actually developed a SaaS-based platform to help event planners create mobile apps, website pages, all sorts of different tools to help them manage their events. We definitely kind of love the web performance discussions that come out of this. We went to Velocity a couple of years ago that kind of spawned a lot of these discussions internally as well. And it's so great to have Barber kind of taking the charge and kind of pushing this in Toronto. So we're glad to be able to help in any way we can and kind of help provide the space for our speakers like Mark to come in and actually talk about all the great things that we hear month after month. So definitely come out to all the other meetups as well. There's been, we do record them, and I'm actually trying live streaming for the first time as well. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, you can, if you go on our YouTube page as well, you can see previous meetups that have happened and kind of get a whole bunch of learning from there as well. So I guess with that, I'll let Barbara kind of kick this off.
All right. So yeah, also from my end, welcome, Happy New Year. I'm very happy that I kind of see now also more and more newbies coming in. So we're kind of, I think, half-half. So spread the word. I love that. That's awesome. So yeah, first meetup for this year, Web Performance Meetup. Mark will be talking about frictionless performance design. I'm very excited about this talk. And please, if you ever want to present as well here, just reach out to me. We're always looking for new speakers, especially certain people in the audience, right? So with that, welcome and enjoy the talk.
All right, thanks, Barbara, and thanks to you guys for coming out tonight. So, yeah, I basically, I'll wrap up in the end kind of where this frictionless performance design topic came from, but the starting topic will just be kind of the psychology behind performance design and how it relates to web development and the things that we create on the web. So I'm Mark. I was working at a company called T and Lax. Some stuff happened recently, and now I am not going to be working there as of Monday. So, as well as 40 other people. So, yeah. My Twitter is Mark Bomber. I sometimes tweet about web development. I usually use it more of a tracker on kind of a trend framework. So, time. Merriam-Webster definition of time is the measured or measurable period during which an action, process, or condition exists or continues. And we all perceive time differently. And this is why things like time estimating, especially as a developer or designer, are extremely hard, because we all have different notions and we've had different experiences in our lives that kind of factor into account when we go to estimate projects and things like that. So there have been tons of studies on time and how it relates to goals and events that are taking place on websites and kind of tasks. And there's been a lot of studies on how to optimize it and how to optimize tasks and goals as efficiently as possible. So this is huge in markets like e-commerce and financial markets where time really does make a big difference. So one thing that I was learning about and kind of blew my mind was that our consciousness is basically lagging 80 milliseconds behind everything that we see and do. Our brain takes about 80 milliseconds to process events that are happening all around us. So that means, like, if I wave my hand, that means that actually happened 80 milliseconds ago, because that's how long it takes the brain to process that waving. So it's pretty crazy. And then there's also images. So images and text and things like that that we see, we actually have to interpret those first. So we have to get that into kind of our brain processing queue, where the 80 milliseconds comes in and then processes what we've actually seen. So it was believed for a long time that this kind of part here was about 100 milliseconds, but recently new studies have shown that it's actually just 13 seconds, or it can be as low as 13 milliseconds. So what does this mean for us? It basically means that any events and actions or animations or transitions that are faster than 80 milliseconds usually just fly underneath the consciousness of ourselves. Like, we basically have a hard time processing what just happened. A real-world example of this is if you've ever watched like a video or a movie, you notice that the soundtrack is kind of out of sync. If that soundtrack is not synced within 80 milliseconds, that's when you get that delay. So next time when you watch a video, you notice that the audio is not exactly synced up, that's what's actually going on. So, so time can also be seen as how long it takes our brains to process information. When we receive information, our brains need time to actually process this and categorize it and whatever else. And the longer the processing takes, the longer that time period will feel to us. And so if your brain doesn't have to process a lot of new information, the time will seem to move faster. So if you've ever done like tutorials or online classes, and you notice that like kind of it takes a while, like a 1 hour class could seem to take a while if all this information that you're learning in that class is all new to you, right? Whereas maybe you do another class or you're reading something that you've read before, that time period which you complete that activity will seem a lot faster. So this is also occurring as we get older. So when we're younger, a lot of the things that we experience and see is new to us, right? Because we've just never experienced or seen those things before. And time at that point will feel a lot slower than when we experience those events and actions further down the road as we get older. Because we've already experienced those events and we've already processed it. So generally in web performance world, we want to measure the amount of time the user perceived an event or action to take. And it's not necessarily how fast the event actually took, but it's more about this. And this is, and what the user thinks is really what matters. So being fast, that's what we want, right? Like we want our websites, we want actions, goals, tasks in our site to be fast, right? And everyone has their own definition of how they classify events as being fast. A lot of people, I think it's natural to compare tasks or events you've experienced before to newer events, and then that's kind of what you use as your baseline and saying like, this is faster than something else, right? Like if you go to a web page, if you go to some photo sharing web page, right, and you see your photos load, and that kind of sets the baseline for you. If you go to another web page and those photos don't seem to load as fast, you'd probably call the other website faster, right? Just naturally. And on the other hand, being slow, it's pretty much the opposite. It's when we perceive something to take longer than the baseline we had in mind. So you've probably noticed that when you're on a website or when you're on a web page and you're trying to perform some task, and that task prompts you with, like, I'll give a real world example. When I want to go pay a credit card bill online with a bank, right? If I didn't have any password saved or browser history, I'd have to put in my email, then I have to put in my card number, then I have to answer a security question, then I have to answer a PIN and then compare an image to the PIN. I have to log in and I have to actually go and find the way of how to pay that bill. But if you asked me before how long I think it would take me to pay that bill, I'd say probably a minute, 2 minutes. Like paying a bill online should be pretty fast in my mind. But in reality, that takes like 5-6 minutes by the time I do all that stuff, right? So that experience will seem to be slow, essentially. And on the opposite side of that, if you're happy and you're having fun while you're performing some task, you're going to perceive that as being fast. And because you can tolerate what's going on. And people expect certain types of pages to behave in a certain way. So if you have a page with like a cover image and then some text, like take Medium for example, right? Like it's a pretty standard blog template nowadays. You'd expect that to be pretty fast because it's pretty lightweight. There's only one image. There's a couple paragraphs or more than that, and you think that would be pretty fast. So, if you're designing something like that, you should be fast in that regard. On the other hand, sites like YouTube, where we're loading videos or there's more content on the page, it's okay to be slower because like YouTube is more of like the rewards that you get out of YouTube can be seen as like more enjoyable. Like you're there to like watch like funny cat videos, or you're there to learn about something, or you know, you just want to catch up on like your YouTube video series, that kind of thing. So like it's okay if it's a little bit slower than other pages or text-only pages for that. So how do we actually trick users into believing something is faster than it actually is? You can use something called temporal illusions, and it's the distortion of time due to processing that we have going on in our minds. So one temporal illusion is the kappa effect. And essentially this is when you have, a real world example is if you have two journeys that take the same amount of time, but one journey is actually longer than the other, the longer journey is going to be perceived as taking a longer amount of time. And that's called the kappa effect. For websites, this means that if you have two actions, or two similar actions on a website, and they take the same amount of time to perform, if you have one action that, let's say, outputs more text to the page or just does more things on the page, that's actually going to be perceived as taking longer, right? So next time you run into that, or you run into two similar actions on web pages, see how much they're outputting and see what they're actually doing to the page. See if you perceive that as taking longer. Another temporal illusion is the oddball effect. So this is when the brain experiences something unusual or out of the ordinary, and it will cause the brain to take longer to process this effect or this event, which will make time seem as it's moving slower. So I have an example of this. Going here. This is something I just found recently. Oh, okay. Let's try. Oh, okay. Demo fail. All right. So anyway, this was, I can show you the screenshot of it, but it was essentially so what I was going to show you guys was basically a website put out by the Royal Canadian Mint, and they have this sort of game where you have to, navigate around the Arctic and just click on different animals and stuff like that. And it was really a different web experience than anything else you might have come across. So there was a lot of like horizontal scrolling, which is kind of a new thing nowadays in web pages. There's kind of like a backpack where you collect badges, and there's goals that you had to achieve. So it was just different, and that sort of thing can appear to take a longer amount of time just because it was so different. Not exactly sure what's going on. There we go. Okay, awesome. All right. So yeah, this is what I was explaining here. So if you try to scroll on this page, this is actually horizontal scrolling, and you'll navigate kind of this way or this way depending on which way you're scrolling. They have this backpack here where you can kind of collect badges. You can click on stuff and you get a badge. And then there's kind of overall goals where you're learning about like the Royal Canadian Mint and why they use certain animals on certain coins. But that's besides the point. The point is, this is different than usual websites, so you'll perceive this as taking longer, and you'll have like 15 minutes spent in here. Could take longer than that, or it could be perceived as taking longer than that. So, yeah, simple diagram, just to wrap up. If you experience stuff out of the ordinary, it's going to be perceived as taking a longer amount of time. A big concept also that we want to think about, we're talking about psychology behind performance, is flow. And this is the psychology behind user engagement. It's the psychology basically behind things that we interact with every day in our lives. So there's 10 factors that this Hungarian psychologist came up with that he states are key in keeping a user engaged in an activity. And here are the 10. But essentially, some of these, are clear in the websites that we build and things like that, like immediate feedback and, activity is intrinsically rewarding. You can kind of see that on a lot of the products that we use nowadays. And on a web page specifically, elements that we have on that page play a critical role in stimulating flow. So if you have certain elements that are taking longer to load or longer to perform an action or animation than other elements, we're going to break flow. We're going to break basically a user's engagement in that. And then the user is going to start, their brain's going to start wandering off. It's going to start thinking about what else it can do and that kind of thing. And they're not going to be as happy about using the product, and it's going to be perceived as slow. So basically what we want to do is we want to have clear goals. We want to have immediate feedback. We want to balance between skills and challenge to kind of help create and maintain the state of flow with the user. And the more a user is engaged in something, the more enjoyable it will be. And if it's enjoyable and they're having a good time, that activity will be perceived as fast. So kind of some design and developer guidelines we've come up with. And again, this is kind of like if you want to take it to the next step and make your products as performant as they can be from kind of the very, very high level. And I guess with that, I should say how I came up with this topic. And it was basically me trying to think where the web is headed in 2015 and so forth. And I think as we come up with all these technologies and we're constantly getting faster in that, HTTP2 is coming out now, so it's going to make web pages even faster, loading assets, that kind of thing. And we have, single page apps. We're starting to get like isomorphic web apps. So the technology is advancing pretty quickly, but I think you still need to hit like the main psychological point of view when you're designing products. So, sorry, back to design guidelines. Understanding users. You want to identify core user stories of a product, and you want to optimize your product around that. So an example of this is, let's say you're building like another Amazon.com, right? What's the first thing that you want your user to do on that site? Buy stuff, right? You want them to be able to search stuff and, more importantly, buy stuff. So you want to optimize a product around that core kind of user story. And then once that core flow is optimized, then you can start looking at kind of adding in other parts of the site and seeing how that affects user perceived time. And this will help it make your product seem faster than other competitors if that core flow is optimized to its full potential. Another example is like Instagram, or you have Snapchat, right, where their whole main focus is like taking photos and sharing photos. So if your app is about taking photos, that should be optimized and as like efficient as possible. So minimal matters as well. If, going back to what I said earlier, if our brains perceive time to be slower as we process more information, it could be said that the more minimal a website is, the faster it will perceive to be, because there's less stuff for our brains to process, right? And basically making a website more minimal could come in the form of like using simpler shapes or using more white space and just using stuff that we've come across before, right? Because the less new information we have to process, the better. And flat design has actually helped us out on this front immensely. There's less, as far as I've seen, there's less like Web 2.0 buttons with all their gradients. There's less like big drop shadows. There's all this kind of thing. Less fancy shapes in most cases. So flat design, definitely a good thing. Color coincides. Color can actually make a difference in speed. There's been a study on like a generic search engine page where they changed the background from white to, let's say, red or yellow. And in that study, it was found that white was actually perceived to be the fastest site, even though it was like loading at the same speed. So there's been another study that I was reading that basically showed that white, blue, and green are amongst the top colors that help increase perceived quickness, whereas red and yellow were less effective. And when I talk about this as being less effective, this is like on the millisecond scale, right? So if you're trying to optimize your product in terms of milliseconds, this is definitely what you want to look into. And another generalization from that study that I saw was that more relaxing colors will also aid in perceived time. A positive emotional state will result in a faster perception of time. This is why relaxed colors help. And white, I think, in that regard, is good because emotionally it's kind of neutral, I would say. And it's neither bad or good, right? Whereas something like red maybe could put you in a more negative emotional state. For me, anyway. So, distinguishable delays. You want to guide your users through delays by introducing additional steps that they could perceive as being necessary. So an example of this is when an app starts loading up. There's the typical example of you have an app that loads up with a blank white screen, right? Versus an app where maybe the layout is already there for you, and it's just the default layout. Now Facebook's doing it on their news feed, right? Where you see like the news feed items, it kind of has like the picture and then kind of some placeholder text, right? As I think earlier on, it was just like white boxes, or I don't know what was there. So the reason this helps is that your brain is actually processing that layout as it first loads, and then your brain has already processed that layout. So anything on top, it should kind of follow that layout, right? And therefore, your brain will perceive it as being faster because it's already processed that layout. If that makes sense. So, last thing for designers, you want to try transitions. Things in the real world just don't disappear and pop into thin air or pop away into thin air just like that, right? Like there's a natural transition between one event to another. And like you've probably experienced this when like you look somewhere and then you look back and there's somebody standing there, right? That wasn't there a second ago. Like that's pretty scary. Like I didn't see you come out of there. Like where did you come from, right? And we just want to do this by like using transitions and animations between events that are occurring on our websites. And otherwise, like people will be taken aback a bit, and maybe they'll feel like they're not in control, and like basically be broken out of the state of flow. So, as a developer, what can you do? Some of these also coincide with designer guidelines. So, you want to always ask yourself, what's the user perceived load time? What's the user perceived load time of how fast this video loaded? What's the user perceived load time of how fast this layout came in, or how fast this action took to complete? You want to provide feedback to everything a user does. So you want to show loading animations. You want to show progress bars for achieving your goal. You want to let the user know that stuff is happening and basically just keep the flow there, maintain it, right? You want to keep them engaged in your product. One last thing for developer guidelines is you want to optimize UI elements. So we're kind of moving more towards this like component-focused front-end system. So we have like React components, we have Polymer components, where we can kind of just take a component, put it on our web page, and it has its own contained CSS and HTML, and just lives in its own kind of box, right, on our web page. And we can optimize each of these individual UI elements to their maximum potential. So, so I've come up with 3 guidelines. First is basically just minimize the number of UI elements on your page. Always think, do I really need all these UI elements to basically allow the user to perform a task they're seeking to do? You want to look at the element characteristics. You want to keep it simple. If there's shapes that you're using on your site, don't use some like crazy like hexagon, square, triangle thing. Just keep it nice and simple, stuff that we've seen before and processed before. And you also want to look at your drawing technique. So this is specifically for like images and videos. Just see how you're loading images onto the page. One example of this is Pinterest. As far as I know, when you're loading like a grid of Pinterest images, right? They're being actually like on the back end and the front end, they're being loaded in parallel, right? but they're actually being loaded in place. So it's like one after another instead of like just like randomly everywhere. Is that still the case? Does anybody use Pinterest regularly? Sort of? Okay. So, yeah, so if those images were popping in everywhere, all over the page, it's confusing for us, and it kind of breaks us out of flow, right? Which flow is the key theory behind engagement. And the more engaged you are, basically, the faster you're going to perceive something to be. And that's really what this whole presentation is about. You want to just create great products that are as frictionless as possible, that keep the user engaged, and basically make them perceive your product as being fast. And that's it. Any questions?
When you, I saw on one slide you ask yourself or users, what is the perceived load time? Do you ask them before or after showing the image or video?
You can do both. You can ask them beforehand. Like, for example, I was using that banking, my bank as an example, and you could ask a user and say, how long do you think it would take to like take a picture and upload it and share it, right? And you can actually walk them through it and then ask them again, how long did you think this actually took, right? And then kind of compare those two and see, maybe ask them as well where the differences came from, or what they thought was going to happen. Because everybody's different as well, right? Like everybody has a different baseline depending on what they've experienced before. If I'm going to Facebook and I'm uploading a picture for the very first time, like I don't know if that's fast or slow, because I've never really done that before. If I'm uploading a picture for the very first time on the internet, so yeah.
I thought it was interesting that you said you were talking about adding transitions and you used the Facebook sort of template loading thing as an example, and that seemed slightly at odds with what you had said earlier about having more stuff to process, creating it or making it seem like stuff is happening slower. So I'm wondering where or how you can find that sort of fine line where the transitions and stuff you're adding in crosses over into being too much to process and creates a slower perceived time.
Yeah. That's a good point. So, like naturally, there's going to be actions you have to perform that is going to update something on your page or change a state of something else, right? And in that case, a transition or animation is definitely the best for that. But I think you also don't want to go too overboard on that transition or animation. Like use something we've all seen before. Like use a fade or use a swipe or whatever animations are trending nowadays, right? So there's still that middle line you can kind of find for that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
And it's highly dependent on your use case, right? So. Anything else?
Cool. Thank you very much. That was the only tonight. If you guys want to hang out, chat, do so. Otherwise,
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hang on. You guys sign up. Yeah. Out of it for like a month.
Actually, yeah, and then I can also.
Okay. Sounds good. All right, Josh. Good presentation. Mark, nice to meet you. Thanks.
How's things? Good.
Yeah. Not right now.
We're trying to make sure.
It ends with a picture of my pride.
Yeah.